should start now?
Yes, I think we should.
Yes. So, before we start, few housekeeping rules, for the audience. We are very thankful to you for joining this particular webinar, which is very, very meaningful and timely. Kindly keep your microphones in silent mode. And if you have any questions, you can, direct it to us, to Alex, to me, Mr. Mandal, and, post the deliberation of Professor Alex Edmonds. He is going to answer, most of them. Thank you. So, with this note, I would now like to request Mr. Mandal to share the formal welcome address with all the attendees and give a warm welcome to Professor Alex Edmonds to come.
So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Hello and good evening to all of you. Let me introduce myself first. I am Debanjan Mandal. I am a lawyer by profession, a partner of Fox & Mandal, and I'm also the chairman of the National Legal Affairs Committee of Indian Chamber of Commerce. The Indian Chamber of Commerce is one of the largest chambers of commerce in the country and one of the oldest as well. We are really grateful to have Professor Alex Edmonds, who I will hereafter refer to as Alex, who is a professor of finance at London Business School. My heartiest welcome to all the dignitaries present here. It is a great privilege to have all of you with us today. We live in a time where there is a commonly held perception that business is not working for common people. And the question, therefore, is that how do we bridge this trust deficit? The question is that if you do good business, or if you have to bridge the trust deficit, does it come at the cost of profit? Many a time it is believed that serving society and earning profit simultaneously is a dream too good to be true. The conventional wisdom holds that for every extra rupee which you spend on societal welfare and societal well-being is 1 rupee taken away from shareholders. However, the way I look at it is as follows. The mantra for many successful companies over the years hasn't been solely profit, but purpose. If an organization is driven by purpose to aid human welfare, it is bound to be more ethical and responsible, meet legislation, and succeed in the long run. With such purpose in mind, ladies and gentlemen, many corporates have come out more responsible than others, even in this ongoing pandemic. We have seen that companies with robust supply chains are being able to bounce back faster than companies which have not invested in supply chain management. And the impetus towards responsible business is slowly rising in the form of environmental, social, and governance-based investing, which we know as ESG investing. ESG investing, ladies and gentlemen, is already widespread in the West. In India, the movement towards ESG investing is gradually gathering pace. You will be happy to know that we already have at least 3 or 4 ESG-focused funds who invest in companies in India. To delve into this deeper, we have kept our topic of discussion today as responsible business in a time of crisis. The crisis being the global pandemic crisis of COVID, and responsible business means business with a purpose. We will thus touch upon the relevant legal provisions also. I'm going to touch upon them very briefly. Alex will address us more from a general point of view. From the perspective of Indian company law, Alex's theory on how profit and purpose is self-reinforcing finds support to some extent in a section of our own company law of 2013. Section 166 of our Companies Act says that directors owe their fiduciary duties not only to shareholders, but also to the environment, the community, and employees at the same level. And this is very important. It is not that shareholders take precedence over the community or the environment. The section does not indicate, mind you, any preference of one over the other. Shareholders don't get preference over the community or the environment. What this means is that there is no hierarchy. Shareholders are to be treated just as well as stakeholders are to be treated. This is a departure from the company law statutes of most Western jurisdictions, and here Alex may want to talk a little more in detail, which strives to maximize shareholder value, or the English approach, as I understand, of enlightened shareholder value, which says that companies should seek to maximize shareholder value but have regard to stakeholder interests. Somewhere, the stakeholders are subservient to the shareholders. India has experimented with a radical stakeholder approach where shareholders and stakeholders are treated at the same level. There is no hierarchy of one over the other. Yet, subsection 2 of section 166, Alex, has been criticized in India owing to its silence on how they are to treat them equally, shareholders and stakeholders, especially in situations of conflicting interests, where you know that if I, as a director, and I serve on the board of several companies as an independent director, if I were to take this particular decision or support this decision taken by the other directors, then the shareholders may not be able to reap a huge profit this year, but the environment will improve. And maybe in a longer span of time, the shareholders will also stand to gain. But I may be wrong. So this is that conflict of interest which is forever plaguing boards of all companies, or most companies, which have in their focus not only shareholder maximization, value maximization, but also stakeholder value maximization. I am really glad that we have an opportunity to learn from Alex on this topic. Alex's work provides huge guidance on how both shareholder interests and stakeholder welfare can be realized simultaneously. By way of introduction, Alex, alongside being a renowned economist and popular teacher, has been known for his exemplary work in corporate social responsibility. He has spoken at the World Economic Forum in Davos, testified in the UK Parliament, delivered a TED Talk on what to trust in a post-trust, post-truth world, as also a TEDx talk titled The Social Responsibility of Business, which has amassed 2 million views. While teaching at Wharton, he has won 14 teaching awards in 6 years. At LBS, he has won the Excellence in Teaching Award for Best Professor across all programs. He has also been named Poets and Quants Best 40 Professors Under 40 and Thinkers 50 Radar. It is indeed a privilege, Alex, for all of us as at Indian Chamber of Commerce to have you amongst us today. It would be very interesting to hear about your new book, Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, which aligns with our tabled discussion today. Actually, the discussion's topic should have been purpose and profit. With these words, Alex, I now urge you to take the forum and share your thoughts. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Debanjan, and thank you to the Indian Chamber of Commerce for hosting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And in particular, while I've given quite a lot of webinars over the pandemic, it's great to have the opportunity to give this to India because you've been a leader in many ways in responsibility, as Debanjan has outlined. So I'm going to talk about responsible business in a time of crisis. I hope to speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have ample time at the end for questions. I'm trying to share my slides, but it's been disabled. If the hosts could re-enable that function, that would be great.
Mr. Banerjee, you have to ask your IT team to enable that.
Yes, Debu, you have already given him the link, so please help him out for sharing the slide.
When I practiced this just before we started, I clicked on share content, but it's not working. So you might have disabled it.
Debu, just sort it out for him. He has to share the slide.
So Alex, give us a minute.
Just give us a minute.
So, I'm just sorry to people for these difficulties. We checked this before we started, and there was a possibility of sharing the slides, and that worked fine. But I think maybe by mistake, accidentally, this option was turned off. So if you only just joined and you're wondering why there's no audio and video, we're just trying to get the slide functionality working again. We'll go through with you very shortly.
Yeah, Alex, there is some issue on the network side for slide sharing. You can continue with your talk, and then the IT team is just getting into it.
Well, it's going to be very difficult for me to give the talk without the slides. Slides are really important to the talk. We had that option before, so it's not a bandwidth issue. So it's just somebody has just turned off the permission. So I was able to share the content previously, so somebody just stopped the permission for that. It's nothing to do with the bandwidth.
The IT team, the systems team is trying. Let us just check.
Now, just give us some time, Alex. Let's figure it out.
Okay, sure.
ट्यूबটা জানো তো Can you email me your slide? Let me see if I can share it.
Yeah, well, I can, but that won't work very well, because then if I want to change the slides, I'm going to have to say next slide every time. So that will be.
There is a serious network glitch that has happened. So under such situation,
right. Okay. Okay. Let me find your email address. Let me. So what is the problem?
See, there is a complete blackout in the system at the back end.
Okay. So if there's no possibility, I might just go ahead without any slides at all. It's not going to be as good, but I'll try that, because I think the other option of you displaying the slides is not going to work. I've sent them over, but.
So there is an issue at the slide sharing area, the complete blackout. So the only option that we can see is if you can email it to me, I will do it from my side.
Yeah, yes, I saw. I've emailed them to you.
Sure. Okay.
Alex, try now. I have made you the host.
Yeah, I think this should be fine now. Yeah, so it's a permissions thing, I think. I don't think it's a network thing.
I think it should work now.
Yeah, so let me
Yeah, it's working.
okay. You can see this now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much to everybody for their patience, and I'm sorry about this. There was a permissions error. So let me. I know that we've all been in a lockdown. So Debanjan and I were saying at the start how we've gone through different phases of lockdown, but let me at least take you metaphorically away from your home offices. I'd like to take you to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 2 continents for 6,000 kilometers, from Lebanon in Asia to Mozambique in Africa. It has some of the world's highest mountains, but it also has some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi, which is on the southernmost tip of the Great Rift Valley. Now, you might think it's hard for you to imagine this lake because you haven't been here, but some of you may have actually seen this lake before, at least in a movie called The Constant Gardener, based on the John le Carré novel of the same name. And indeed, probably millions of people around the world have seen this movie have seen the lake because of the movie. But fewer than 1,000 people call Lake Magadi their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, who makes a living selling and herding goats. So it used to be that for Emmanuel, cash was king. So it was cash that he would receive when he sold a goat. It would be cash that he'd have to then check in case it was forged. He'd have to store that cash at risk of robbery. And then when he wanted to bank that cash, it would take him an entire day to go to the nearest bank. And so his life was really, really tough. But all of this changed because of a responsible business. And that responsible business was Vodafone, the UK mobile operator. So as some of you might know, Vodafone launched a mobile money service, M-Pesa, in 2007. Now let me explain what mobile money is, because you might think it's mobile banking. So I have a bank account and I can just operate it on my phone rather than going to a branch. But that's actually not what mobile money is. For mobile money, you don't even need a bank account. And that's really important because many people in Kenya don't have access to the banking network. So this had a huge effect on the life of Emmanuel. Right, so he no longer needs to deal with cash. He no longer needs to worry about being robbed or his cash being stolen. And he can graze his goats on the greenest pastures. He doesn't need to be close to a bank, and because the bank is one whole day away. And more generally than just Emmanuel, there was a study which found that after 7 years of the launch of M-Pesa, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty. And many of those households were headed up by women because they were able to move from retail to agriculture. Now, that was one story about Vodafone. Let me tell you another story. And that second story surrounds tax. So in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company in the entire world to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they were paying to governments worldwide. And that's really important, right? Because in the telecoms industry, you could choose to locate your licenses in low tax regimes. So it's quite easy to try and to be able to dodge tax. Okay, so I've got 2 questions for those of you who are still on this webinar. One is, which of these decisions created most value for society? And the second is, which of these decisions, if they had not been taken, would have led to the most public outrage or worsened Vodafone's corporate social responsibility rating or reputation? Now, I'm not going to poll anybody because I'm pretty sure that everybody on this webinar will have the same answer. Which decision created most value for society? It was the first one. So by launching M-Pesa, Vodafone lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. But what would have happened if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa? Well, there would have been no public outrage. But you don't get into trouble for not launching an innovation. People would have not even expected them to think of this idea of M-Pesa. Why? Because it was something innovative. People might not have realized that there was even this crazy possibility of launching this idea of banking without a bank. But what would the public outrage be if you were not transparent on tax? It could be something massively negative. And indeed, a few years before, like Vodafone was actually hauled up for not being fair on tax. The Citizens Group reported in 2010 that Vodafone had avoided £6 billion of tax. And it just so happened that at the same time, George Osborne, who was the Chancellor, announced £6 billion of spending cuts. And you can see what the newspapers claimed, but you, the taxpayer, are suffering because this greedy company is cheating on taxes. And so what is the consequence of that? It is some boycotts, and that's indeed what Vodafone suffered. So what is the message that I'm giving everybody on this webinar? So what is it what does a responsible business involve? It certainly involves do no harm. Right? We don't want to cheat on tax. We don't want to pollute the environment. We don't want to mistreat our workers. And we don't want to price gouge our customers. But I want to change our thinking because you didn't need to come on this webinar to understand that responsible businesses should do no harm. Instead, I'd like to elevate the notion of responsible business to say it's about actively doing good. Right? Because what we agreed was that on this slide, the most important decision for society was the launch of M-Pesa that lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. It was not the activity which was just about do no harm. So responsible business isn't just about avoiding scandals, it's about positively creating value through innovation and excellence. And so that goes to the framework that I use in the book that Debanjan quite kindly mentioned. So I view the value that a company creates as being given by a pie. And that pie can either be split as profits to investors or as value to stakeholders, such as wages to workers or taxes to the government and the like. And we often think that responsibility is about splitting the pie fairly, so moving from this to this. So anything that we can do to ensure a fairer split of the pie, to ensure that stakeholders do well, not just shareholders, is indeed responsible. And indeed, India has been a pioneer on this. For example, the law to give 2% of profits to CSR initiatives, and the law which, as Debanjan says, unlike UK law, this gives stakeholders equal priority with investors. So obviously India is already leading the world in terms of these notions of equality. But what I want to do is to elevate the discussion and say that responsible business can't just be splitting the pie. Why? Because if indeed responsibility is about moving from this to this, then there's two problems. The first problem is that companies will do the minimum possible. Because if responsibility is about making the company less profitable, they will not go above and beyond what the minimum requirement is. So maybe once the company has given 2% of its profits, it will not do anything further than that. Right? Because if responsibility is something that's bad for the blue, we don't want to do more than we need to. The second reason why responsibility can't just be about splitting the pie differently is that it's bad for investors. Now, many people might think, well, I don't care, right? Because we often think about investors as them and society stakeholders as us. And so we might think that anything that we can do to take and give to us is good, right? We often think that investors are nameless, faceless capitalists. But that's actually not the case, right? Because investors are not them, they are us. So they include parents saving for their children's education, they include pension funds saving for retirement, they include insurance companies laying aside to fund future claims. So anything that we want to do in order to repurpose business must take investors seriously. We must ensure that companies indeed serve wider society, but they also must remain profitable. And indeed, this is why my notion of responsible business is that it's about growing the pie. So we absolutely do want to create social value. We want to increase the orange, but we do this not by giving stakeholders a greater slice of what's already there, but through innovation, through excellence, through something like M-Pesa. Why? Because Vodafone launched M-Pesa genuinely to serve a social need, to address the problem of lack of financial inclusion in Kenya. However, as a byproduct, they were ultimately able to monetize it, and therefore investors were better off. And so that is my view of responsible business, which I've called pie economics. So it seeks to create profits only through creating value for society. So let me pick apart this definition. Right, so before you joined this webinar, you would have known the final four words. So responsible business is absolutely about creating value for society. But let me emphasize the start of this definition, right? It seeks to create profits through creating value for society. So indeed, it's important to give 2% of your profits to CSR initiatives, but I'm saying that responsibility must go beyond that, and it involves things like innovation. It's not enough to comply with that law. And the other important word is the word only, because you can create profits by splitting the pie differently, by moving from here to here. So you might know some pharmaceuticals companies in America which bought existing drugs and hiked the prices. That's creating profits by extracting from society. But what we're saying here is that we want to make sure that we are profitable, but only as a byproduct of solving social problems. Now, at this point, you might think, well, everything Alex says, that sounds good, but where's the evidence? It seems unrealistic. It seems almost too good to be true that if companies were to think about wider society, they might become more profitable. So as Debanjan was saying at the start, what I try to base a lot of what I say is on rigorous evidence. And so that is my job as a finance professor. So people often think, well, as a professor, you're divorced from the real world. But in fact, the fact that I am sort of somewhat distant from any particular company means that I can analyze what happens across many, many companies to make sure that what I find is something which is widespread. Okay, and that's indeed what I try to do. So one of the things, I'm skipping a few slides just because we weren't at the start. One thing I wanted to do was to look at what is the link between how well a company treats society and its long-term shareholder performance. Now, in order to do that, you need a measure of how well a company is serving society. So what I chose to look at was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America, which was published now by Fortune magazine. So why did I choose to look at that? Well, you might think it only looks at employees. Why don't I look at customers or the environmental taxpayers? Well, I chose this because I had a really good measure available. So this measure was good for two reasons. First is that it was around since 1984. So I had tons of data. So one of the problems with CSR is that it's a relatively new initiative. So many data points have only been available since, let's say, 2010. And we know that since 2010, the economy has been in a big upswing. And so if I found a relationship which was only true between 2010 and say 2020, it might well be that that relationship only holds in good times. Maybe right now, when we're in a pandemic, we need to think just about shareholders because stakeholders is a luxury. That I have this data from 1984 to 2011 means that I had 28 years of data, which importantly included the financial crisis, included the collapse of the internet. The second reason why this was a great data set was that it was very thorough. So it looks at how well you treat your employees by studying not only quantitative factors like pay and benefits, but also qualitative factors such as trust in management, pride in your job, and camaraderie with your colleagues. Yes, it's important to pay people well, but there can be companies that pay their employees well, but don't provide them with meaningful work or a psychological safety. So what I wanted to do was to look at whether the companies that do well in this list, whether they actually perform better or are just distracted from the bottom line. Now, you might think there's a challenge here because let's say Google is on this list and we know that Google has done really well. Well, how do we know that that's due to employee satisfaction? It could just be that the tech industry happened to do well or some other factor. So for every company on this list, I have to control for what industry you're in, recent performance, and a whole host of other factors. And we also know that correlation does not imply causation. So we have to do further tests to show that it's employee satisfaction that leads to better long-term performance, rather than long-term performance causing a company to perform well. So what's the bottom line for practitioners, which is what everybody else in this audience is? I found that the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered stock returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period. And so that's 89 to 184% cumulative. That is serious stuff. So it suggests that companies that treat their workers well are not just fluffy companies, but are companies that are profitable and sustainable in the long term. So what I want to do, final 3 short sections, is to highlight the implications of all of this research for practitioners. So the first is just the centrality of thinking about society. So I haven't actually used the word CSR much in the talk. Why? Because CSR sometimes has connotations as being something which is non-core, which could be delegated to a CSR department, which just donates money to charity. Instead, what the findings suggest is that serving society is a CEO level issue. So it's not just something for a CSR department, it is consistent with long-term success and long-term profitability. It should be taken seriously by the executive team and by the board. And what are the implications for investors? So when I went to my first socially responsible investing conference in 2007, when I was a professor at Wharton, the investors there were not mainstream investors that you might have heard of. Instead, they were socially responsible investors, which cared about other factors, such as climate change or gender diversity. Their only goal was not to make financial returns. But I think what the results suggest is that even if you are a mainstream investor and the only thing that you care about is making as much money as possible, which is fair, right? Because a pension fund must save for its beneficiaries, you should still look at these responsibility dimensions because they're linked to long-term value. Like people often think, well, there's financial factors and there's non-financial factors, and responsibility is a non-financial factor, but the evidence suggests that these non-financial factors are actually financial in the long term. So the next question is how do we put it into practice? So I just said it's important, we want to be more responsible, but how do we actually do this? And I want to get to some of these trade-off concepts that Debanjan mentioned when he started. Because what elephants in the room here is how we actually make these decisions under responsible business. Is it really possible to put shareholders on equal priority with every stakeholder? Well, if that's the case, well, how do we make decisions? Because there are decisions where some people will benefit and some people will not. So in the book, in chapter 3, I provide a very practical guide for how to make those decisions based on 3 principles. I don't have the chance to go through all of them now because I want to make sure there's enough time for questions. I'm only going to go through the 3rd principle, which is called the principle of materiality. And in order to do this, I first want to explain what I mean by purpose, because it's been something that Debanjan alluded to. It's been a subtext to my talk, but it's never been properly defined. So often, we think about the word purposeful as being a synonym for altruistic, right? A purposeful company is one that serves wider society. But that's actually not what the word purposeful means. A purposeful meeting is one that is focused and targeted. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. So, what does it mean to be a purposeful company? It's one that is focused and targeted. So this is why I think that the idea of treating everybody equally, that is just not realistic, because there will be decisions that you will make which help some stakeholders and hurt others. For example, Engie, that's the French energy company, it faced the decision of should we close the Hazelwood power plant. So this was the most polluting power plant in the OECD. If it closed it, it would be good for the environment, but it would be bad for workers. And so if your purpose was in the first bullet to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, and communities, put everybody equal, that doesn't guide you on making that decision. So instead, I believe purpose should be targeted. It's the answer to the question, how is the world a better place by your company being here? And that answer cannot be everything. If you were to ask a citizen that question, they couldn't say it was to be a teacher and a lawyer and a banker and an entrepreneur. You choose one of those things. And so this goes to the concept of materiality, which is to actually say, I'm not going to treat all stakeholders equal. There are particular stakeholders that are especially material for my company's business, and I'm going to prioritize them. And this gets to the study that I'm going to show in terms of research. So what this graph is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Is it goes through each industry by industry, and highlights what are the material stakeholders for that industry. Let's take the first column, which is extractives and minerals processing. So there, the environment is important, right? Because if you are having a flood, you're not going to be able to operate your mines. But what happens if you're in the financial sector? Well, the environment isn't so important because if there's a flood, it's not going to affect the ability to borrow and lend. But what matters much more is social capital, customer privacy, data security, selling practices and product labeling, because if you fail on that, then you're going to breach customer trust. And so what that means is that, yes, we know that climate change is the order of the day, but maybe if you're a bank, you should focus even more on your social capital than on climate change. And what this study looked at was it looked at the MSCI measure of ESG, which is perhaps the most famous measure available. And it took study firms that did well across the board. They beat the market on every dimension of sustainability. But what they found was that in terms of financial performance, they did not beat the market. They only beat the market by 1.5% per year, which was statistically insignificant. Instead, the companies that did well on the material issues, but scaled back on the immaterial ones, were the ones that beat the market. So surprisingly, it's better to do well in only a few activities than to do well in every activity. Because if you're doing well on every activity, you don't have a priority list. It could well be that you are just not even considering your shareholders. And so this gets to my final part, which is how do we apply this to the crisis? So right now we've had a bad pandemic, and we've got some companies which have responded to this crisis in some amazing ways. So what they've done is they've split the pie differently. They've tried to be fair. So there's some companies where CEOs are being paid nothing. Some companies that keep paying their workers, even though the workers are furloughed. So one example is Wynn Resorts, the hotel chain. And there's some companies which are giving free products to customers. Unilever is giving 100 million euros of food and sanitizer. So all of these activities are great, and all companies who do them, they should be praised. But why I started this talk with the importance of pie growing is that not every company can split the pie. Right? Not every company has 100 million euros. And what if you're not in the food and sanitizer industry, you don't have products to donate? So this is why I believe responsibility is about growing the pie. It's not just throwing money at the problem, but it's innovating and being excellent. So a responsible business asks themselves the question, what is in your hand? What resources does your company have? And how can I think creatively about how to use them to serve wider society? So let me go through a few examples. So let's say you are Chelsea Football Club, right? You don't clearly have anything to give to society, but what is in your hand? It's a hotel, and you are allowing doctors and nurses to stay at that hotel after doing a shift in the hospital. And this applies to companies not in different industries. So Ford, the car company, is using its airbag material to make masks. You can have a perfume company like LVMH, which is now using its perfume factories to make sanitizer. Or you can have companies which are making gowns and stuff. What about large companies hit by the crisis? So let's take Qantas Airways, right? They would love to keep paying their workers in the crisis, but they simply can't, right? Because they just don't have enough money. They'll go out of business. It's not going to be commercial. But what is in their hand is a relationship. And that relationship is with Woolworths, which is a grocery store in Australia. Now, historically, that relationship was such that if you bought groceries from Woolworths, you would be able to earn air miles. But what they've done is they've leveraged that relationship so that if you are a furloughed worker from Qantas, you can be redeployed to Woolworths, so you keep their job, and this also helps Woolworths because they're able to satisfy demand. And what if you're a really small company? So let me talk about a small company that I'm a customer of. It's called Barry's Boot Camp. It's a boutique gym, which is in London and also around the world. David Beckham is one of the clients who goes to this gym. Now, all of these gyms are shut. So how can they help in the crisis? Well, one thing they're doing is they're offering free online fitness classes. And that makes a big difference because there's many people who are self-isolating at home. But you might think, well, that's not that innovative for a fitness company to offer fitness classes. But here's the really nice thing. Let's say you are a desk worker in the boot camp. Well, you work at the reception. You are furloughed, so how can you help out in the crisis? And what it turns out is that many of these desk workers are actors. So because acting is such a volatile career, they take this desk job in order to provide a stable income. Now, if you're an actor, what is in your hand? Well, you are very funny. Well, now, how does that help in the crisis? Well, there's many parents who have their children at home because the schools are shut. And so what they're offering is free Zoom storytelling sessions where they can take off the load of working parents. Now, that might seem really small, but be able to take the children off the parents for an hour or two during a complex conference call, that could make a huge difference. Okay, so I'm going to hand back to Debanjan and open up to questions, but the book here is called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. And why I wrote this is that there's a lot of misperception about responsibility. And people often think, well, a responsible company, that's a fluffy company which is distracted from the bottom line. There's a trade-off between stakeholders and shareholders, as Debanjan was saying. But I wanted to say, well, no, based on rigorous evidence, there need not be a trade-off. In fact, serving society can lead to long-term performance, but we must do this in a discerning way, for example, taking materiality into account. So it's available right now. You can look through Amazon and Flipkart, just like any other book in India, but also for those of you who prefer it on Kindle, there is that option also. But thank you so much again for inviting me and for the attention. I'm just going to stop sharing now, just to hand back to Debanjan to go to the Q&A.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. We're really grateful.
Yes.
It was very, very insightful. Your examples of Vodafone and all the other companies, and how it is possible to make profits at the same time serve society and for a purpose. It's not profit for the sake of profit alone. It's profit for the sake of a purpose. So now I would invite question and answers. Or Debmanlo, would you like to say a few words now while the questions come up?
There are some questions which people have given it to us well in advance, and the topic they have googled it out. So may I ask these questions to Alex?
Absolutely, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a question which has come. What is the difference between business and entrepreneurship?
So I'd say there's a huge difference to that. I'd say entrepreneurship, that is a business which tries to be innovative. So I'd say it's a particular type of business, but one which is trying to be innovative. And I think what one of the punchlines of my talk is that responsibility is not just about being fair, it's about being innovative and trying to do things that fail. So it involves creating a culture where people are safe about taking risks. And that's possible even in large conglomerates. So let's take Tata, the famous Indian conglomerate, right? What they do is they give awards to employees who fail. So if you have an idea that fails, but that failure was an instructive failure, they reward that. And I think that's something great where you can still have this culture and not be afraid of making mistakes in even a large organization like Tata.
Right. So there is one more question. What is your views on CSR spending post-COVID? Is it going to get impacted deeply? Are people going to recover the losses which they have? People means the business entrepreneurs, the losses which they have incurred during COVID times in terms of depreciation on the business volume, sales figure. Is it going to impact the CSR spending, or is it going to continue in the same pace?
I think it will unfortunately impact it. I think just realistically, right, a lot of companies, their balance sheets are really hit. And if a company was to spend a lot on CSR and not be able to keep its workers, I think that would just be really bad for its reputation. So, but what my point is about responsibility is it's not just about spending money. So treating your workers well, that doesn't just involve giving them a free gym and lots of sort of matching their charitable donations. It involves that providing them with meaningful work. So maybe if you're a junior employee, does your boss give you the opportunity to step up? So I used to be an investment banker at Morgan Stanley. When I was just a first-year analyst, I was allowed to go to a meeting with a global head of investment banking and present. And so I think things like that, where you're giving opportunities to workers to step up, those things don't cost you a lot. And indeed, if you think about how companies think about their customers, something like what Barry's Bootcamp is doing with the storytelling sessions, those things again aren't spending huge amounts of money, but it's more a mindset shift. How can we use what's in our hand to serve wider society? And so I think responsibility should be much more about that rather than spending money. What was really interesting is that in response to the Black Lives Matter campaign, right, some companies were donating a huge amount of money to that movement. And obviously, I really am sympathetic to these initiatives and to racial equality more generally. But for me, I thought, well, that's a bit of an easy option. Well, it's much easier for a company to spend money than to tackle the inequality within the organization. So why don't we have enough black people or enough Asian people within the company, or maybe we do. Whenever we're going to present to a client or to do a big meeting, it's going to be a white old man because they we think have more gravitas. So I think it's much harder to address these things, which don't cost you money, but cost you an attitude and a culture shift, than to write a check.
Yeah, in fact, one particular person has already mentioned that he is in sync with it, but in India, the culture is, maximizing the shareholder value instead of CSR, etc. I think, we as a country need to come out of that. He's writing, Debmalia, what Alex said is very relevant even in India, because companies are responsible for what they give back to society, as only focusing on giving returns to shareholders. I think, is more priority here than giving back to the society. So I think, this culture in India needs to change, at least.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So there are 2-3 more questions. Do you think SMEs, small and medium enterprises or medium small enterprises, is it possible for them to adhere to the culture of becoming a responsible business? Given the fact that they work on very, very wafer thin margins, their turnover is on a much lower side, and in fact, most of them are entrepreneur. It's a people driven kind of. It's a family driven unit, especially at least in India.
Yes, I think so, and this is very important, because many people think that responsibility is only something that you can pursue once you're a big company, because only once you're a big company do you have loads of money. But again, this is why I think it's really important to think about responsibility as an attitudinal shift, rather than just spending a lot of money on things. So what I'm going to put here in the chat is a podcast interview I did with a social entrepreneur. So she's somebody who started the business. It's a bakery, and they were featured when Meghan Markle did her Vogue issue. She interviewed them. And one of the big things is to provide employment to disadvantaged women. So these are women who are victims of domestic abuse, or women who've suffered poverty and so forth. And so for her, she doesn't perceive there to be a huge trade-off, because she sees these women as women who are great potential employees, but traditional companies won't look at these women because they don't have sort of the CVs or the records that traditional companies want. And so she thinks that, again, responsibility, she's not paying them massive amounts of money, but she's giving employment to people who otherwise would be turned down, even though they're great workers. And so I do think it is possible and realistic to think about responsibility as a small business, particularly if you think about responsibility is providing opportunities for employees to step up, listening to customers, performing trusting relationships, rather than just a huge public expenditure, public relations expenditure exercise.
All right. Right. There are a few more questions, like there are a lot of organizations across the world where layoffs are happening in view of COVID-19. Salaries are also being cut. So like you also pointed out that it will take a toll on the reputation of a company if they reduce the funding on the CSR side. It will give rise to reputation risk instead of giving fancy things to the employees. So do you think salary cuts in view of COVID times, will it maximize the shareholders' value, or it's just an entrepreneurial mindset not to pay?
Yes, yeah, this is a very important point, and I think
this is also going to be a reputation risk.
So I think here it's important to recognise that actually some cuts to employees are unfortunately inevitable. Growing the pie doesn't mean growing the firm. It doesn't mean preserving full employment. We do need to take commercially important decisions. So there are some sectors which will permanently downsize after the pandemic. And so keeping employees employed in a sector which isn't serving society as much because we don't need as much travel, that's bad for society, because those people could instead be working in other growing areas, say cybersecurity or something like that. So Airbnb is an example which has laid off its workers. It had to take that commercial decision, because if it didn't take that tough decision, it might end up just going out of business. But it's taken this tough decision in a humane way. So it said to the people that we're going to make redundant, we're going to give you 14 weeks of severance pay, when the legal minimum in some countries is 2 weeks. They're going to also allow them to keep medical insurance for an entire year, which is really important in a pandemic. And also they've allowed their employees to keep their laptops, even if they're company laptops, because they know they'll need them in order to find a new job. So I think we do need to make these commercially important decisions, otherwise the business go under.
Like some of the companies in India are doing like this, like one of the global ride-hailing companies, which is whose India headquarter is in Mumbai. They have laid off a lot of people. They have closed down their Mumbai office. And they are allowing the employees to keep the laptop till 31st December. That they're allowing some, but not everyone is following this. And 14 weeks, normally in India, people are paying for 8 weeks salary, 2 months. 14 weeks, I don't think any company is adhering as of now.
Yeah, so yeah, not every company will do that, but I think the companies that are able to do that, they'll suffer a big reputational lift to this. For example, let's say you're Airbnb, some of your colleagues have been made redundant, and you, if you know that they haven't been that well treated, you're going to be less motivated yourself. So I think it has a positive impact on the other employees who stay, because a lot of workers are friends with each other. You are sad when one of your colleagues loses their job, and also if you're a customer, and you know that in the travel sector it's declining, maybe you're going to have a lot of choice, I will choose to go for a travel company which I know is treating their workers fairly. Certainly I do this as a customer, right? For food, I get a lot of food delivered to me in the pandemic, and there's certain companies which do a lot of work in order to reduce their packaging. And even though they're more expensive, I actually switched my supplier, and also the one that my mum has, to a company which doesn't use any plastic packaging, even though they're a bit more expensive, because plastic packaging would be cheaper.
Right. So there is one last question. How do you think that as a country, see, you are talking to an Indian audience now. How do you think we can improve and imbibe the culture of responsible entrepreneurship in India?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question. And actually, I got some
companies. It's the middle rung companies who needs to come up the learning curve. And how do you think that is possible in a emerging economy like India?
And I think this is where the evidence is important. So this is why a lot of the work that I do is to show that actually purpose and profit are not at the expense of each other. So as a professor, right, most professors spend all their time at academic conferences and writing for journals and going and giving talks at Harvard or Wharton or Stanford. I love doing things like this, speaking to practitioners like you and all of the people on this webinar, to show, well, actually, these are things to be taken seriously. It's not just for the big companies that only if you can afford it can you think about being responsible. Responsibility involves an attitudinal shift, not so much spending a huge amount of money. And if you're doing this, this is actually supportive of your long-term shareholder returns. Can I also, answer a couple of questions that Shruti Swiker, he just messaged me on the chat. But I think this was he or she, private rather than public. But I'll just get to the questions because I've seen them. One of them is, Big Pharma spends big money on research. If Big Pharma comes up with a vaccine, how much is it okay for them to exploit it? And this is a really tricky question. So unfortunately, I'm going to give this typical academic answer. Right? On research, right? Because research is really expensive, and only 5% of drug development succeed. You do need to be able to make money in order to fund future drugs. But I think for something which is as complicated and as widespread as a pandemic, where it's affecting people's lives, I do think it shouldn't just be a profit opportunity. So if you did something, let's say, for skincare, right there, I don't mind the company charging high prices to recoup it, because it's not a life or death matter. So here, while they obviously need to cover their costs, I think particularly if this is something that they're providing to developing countries where they can't afford it, they should be selling that as close to cost as possible, but they should be able to charge and get at least a modest profit if they're to sell it to the UK and the US. Right. The other question that Shruti asked me is that when there are pay cuts announced by companies, these are inversely proportional to the balance sheet of the company. What are the points that a promoter should keep in mind? So I think it's the idea of allowing people who can pay most to bear the most burden. So maybe a high proportional pay cut to the executive suite, then maybe a little less to the senior management team, less to the mid-managers, and maybe nothing to the people at the bottom. Why? Because it's the idea that if the wealthier people can suffer some of the pay cuts more, so we want to make sure that the burden of a shrinking pie is split fairly.
Right, Alex. I think, a lot of questions were already there with us, and you answered all of them. Before the program started, only people had WhatsApped us some questions. Knowing you, they have gone through the Google, read about you. I personally have gone through your university websites and read more about you, so that this interaction becomes more meaningful. So now, Mr. Mandal, you'd like to ask anything, or otherwise then I will go for a formal vote of thanks.
I have nothing. I have lots of questions with you, but I will not take any more of Alex's time. So, but Debmala, why don't you start with the vote of thanks?
Right. So, Alex, it was a pleasure on behalf of Indian Chamber of Commerce, on behalf of Mr. Mandal, myself, and obviously, this wouldn't have happened if Rudresh Mandal, our young colleague, if he wouldn't have connected, both of us with you. And we are very thankful to him for connecting you with us. On behalf of Mr. Mandal, myself, and ICC other, management, I would like to formally thank you for taking your time out and sharing these thoughts with us. In a growing economy like India's, maximizing shareholder value without losing the touch of humility is very, very important. Through your deliberations, what we learned today is that one needs to be human, one needs to be having the qualities of humility, and it's not only about profit. Profit is imperative, and that is the fundamental for running a business. But as you put a question in your particular slide, that what impact does your company do by being present on Mother Earth? So that is a very, very relevant question. What are you doing for the society? So I think this kind of deliberations are very important, because India is a growing economy and more entrepreneurs are getting created every day. The culture of startup has started in India for the last 5-6 years. So from a very, very young age, people should be cognizant of such kind of culture, that yes, business doesn't mean only earning money and maximizing my own bank balance, but it is also about what I do for the society. So I think it had been a good learning for all the people who have participated in this particular deliberation. This particular session was also streamed live in YouTube. So, and it will be obviously available in the YouTube channels. People who are interested, your stakeholders who are interested, can always access to it and can relook at what you had said and how you handled all the questions, which was very, very meaningful, and it added a lot of value to our discussion and deliberation today. With this note, I again, propose formally a hearty vote of thanks on behalf of ICC, Mr. Mandal, and myself. Thank you, Alex. Thank you all for joining us and making this webinar a successful one.
Thank you so much, Tabu. Thank you, Debanjan, and thank you to the Indian Chamber of Commerce. It was great to be here, and thanks to everybody for joining, and to Rudresh Mandal, who put us in touch. But that was the perfect example of growing the pie. So it didn't involve financial expenditure, but involved the attitude of, let me put these people in touch with each other. That's an example of innovation and excellence, and hopefully many people think this is worthwhile. So thank you very much to Rudresh also for putting this together. And obviously, if people come up with questions afterwards, which you didn't think of right now, feel free to get in touch with me with LinkedIn. By LinkedIn, I'd be very happy to answer any further questions that people have. Take care, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.